Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jim Ogle. I'm the Executive Director of Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, and I'm pleased to welcome you here tonight to our program on the sites in Freedom's Frontier representing the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Tonight, we're going to tell you the story of the Fort Scott National Historic Site. But before we begin, a few housekeeping items for you as attendees. As you watch the program tonight and the presentation, you may find a question comes to mind. Well, you don't have to remember it till we get to our question and answer session. If you look at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, there should be a Q&A button that will allow you to type in a question. I'll then ask it for you when we get to the question and answer session. There's also a way to talk with our presenter directly. You also have access at the bottom of your screen to a raise your hand button, or next to your name in some cases. Just raise your hand, I'll call on you, open your microphone, and then you can ask questions of our presenter. Now, I'd like to just take a moment to share with you a little bit about Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area and our efforts in the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom that we did during this month of September and into October. We have so many sites, we had to extend our month along the way. So our mission at Freedom's Frontier is to tell the stories of the struggles for freedom in our region and their lasting impact on our nation. So those three nationally significant stories we tell are the Missouri-Kansas border war and the Civil War, the settling of the frontier, and the enduring struggle for freedom. Now, we cover an area of 41 counties along the Missouri-Kansas border. 29 are on the Kansas side, 12 on the Missouri side. A total of 3 million people live in our boundaries, and we're the size of South Carolina in terms of square miles. Now, our Freedom's Frontier map has long been a good tool to helping you find those sites along the way. But we also felt it was very important as part of the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom kickoff that we did in September, that we also used and provided some additional tools to make it easier for you to visit these sites. We created an app, and I want to take a moment to share a little bit about that app with you.
Sometimes the most important stories aren't widely told. Sometimes what matters the most remains a secret, even if it's right in front of us. There's a place that defined the history of our nation, where patriots fighting for freedom gained victories that lasted through the years to secure equal freedoms for all Americans. We're talking about the Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. If you didn't know you had such a place around you, the FFNHA app is for you. You'll discover important historic sites and museums, all connected to tell the remarkable stories that shaped our nation. The settlement of the frontier, the border war and Civil War, and the enduring struggle for freedom. Thanks to our easy-to-use app, you'll find tours and amazing places to visit that bring the region together and make it come alive. Visit the App Store or the Google Play Store. Download the FFNHA app and discover the stories that changed a nation. Enjoy the ride. History awaits.
And we do think there is some exciting and interesting history that awaits you here in Freedom's Frontier. As you can see from this shot of the opening screen of the Freedom's Frontier app, we have on our home page the International Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Tour. Now, this tour shows you the different sites that exist throughout Freedom's Frontier that you can visit as part of the Underground Railroad Tour. It includes tonight's focused site, the Fort Scott National Historic Site. Now, one of the things we're able to offer with the National Park Service's participation is that through the app, you can earn a digital passport stamp for visiting the site. And these passport stamps are highly treasured by many people. And you can even collect an entire grouping of these sites as part of the Underground Railroad, and we urge you to do so. All you have to do is go to the location, and the digital passport stamp will automatically pop into your phone or mobile device. As mentioned in that video, you can find the app on the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store for those of you with Android devices. Now, as part of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, we are part of a much larger network. As you can see, there are 21 sites in the state of Kansas and 2 sites in the state of Missouri that fall within the Freedom's Frontier borders of the 4 sites mentioned. And we're excited that both governors thought it was important to proclaim the month of September in support of, my apologies, my phone wasn't turned off, as part of the story of the Underground Railroad and their willingness to support telling these stories along the way. We're excited that Fort Scott is one of those sites that you can visit along the way. And we're excited that one of our partners in this effort is Travel Kansas. We're particularly thrilled that Travel Kansas is part of creating that website you saw there, has also worked very hard to promote and develop this video that I'd like to share with you now.
Whereas, Kansas has a rich history as being a part of the Underground Railroad, a network of people who work together to hide and transport freedom seekers on their journey north. And
whereas the Underground Railroad played a significant role in the elimination of slavery in the United States and was a foundation for future civil rights movements, and
whereas we are deeply motivated by the efforts of the courageous people who traveled the Underground Railroad and looked to Kansas as a gateway to freedom, as they have been a source of inspiration to generations of Americans. And
whereas Kansas has 29 counties who are part of the Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, and whereas the state is home to 21 Underground Railroad Network to Freedom sites managed by the National Park Service, which continue to tell the story about the nation's struggle for freedom that did not end with the Civil War. And
whereas, in appreciation of the efforts of those who manage and preserve the sites of the Underground Railroad in Kansas, and those from around the world who have committed themselves to document and share the stories of the Underground Railroad and the enduring struggle for freedom in Kansas.
Now, therefore, I, Laura Kelly, Governor of the State of Kansas, do hereby proclaim September 2020 as National Underground Railroad Month in Kansas, and ask all Kansans to join me in honoring those from our past who pursued freedom by traveling the Underground Railroad, and in expressing gratitude for those who helped them on their way, and to join together to continue the fight for freedom and equality for everyone.
We hope you'll be able to visit the Travel Kansas site, which is still up and provides information on these Underground Railroad sites as well. So I'm really thrilled to welcome our presenter this evening. Carl Brenner began his federal service as a wildland firefighter in Virginia in 1992. He started with the National Park Service at Shenandoah National Park in 1996 and moved to the Grand Canyon in 1997. He moved to California in 1999 and was the park's first education specialist and eventually the first chief of interpretation. He participated in details and program reviews in multiple parks in California and Oregon. He moved to Lake Meredith, Nash NRA, and Albades Flint Quarries in 2016, and currently is the Chief of Interpretation, Education, and Resource Management at the Fort Scott National Historic Site. I'm really pleased to bring up on the screen Carl Brenner. Carl, let me kill my screen share and introduce you now to all the folks here and let you take this presentation away.
Outstanding. I'm sorry you have to see me so largely on the screen now. I appreciate everybody tuning in. This is an exciting month that we've been going through. The other programs have been stellar. I'm hoping to keep the bar as high as Jim has created it. So as we're going through this tonight, I'm going to be asking some questions at the beginning and at the end to try to get some feeling from you, the participants, about different things that are going on, because I don't want this to just be directly me speaking at you, but a dialogue. So to go through this process, I want to first of all share that Fort Scott National Historic Site, part of the Underground Railroad, is not always the first place you think of when you talk about the fight for freedom in the Underground Railroad. However, this is right along some major corridors of it. But before we get into that, I want to ask a question. And if you have access to the chat box, if I can get you to, if you feel comfortable with it, enter some of your thoughts in the chat about how do you feel when you're left out of a conversation? How does that make you feel? You can either share that with just the panelists or with all participants if you wish. As either everybody is scrambling to try to find where the chat box is. Outstanding, unrepresented. Thank you for kicking us off, Holly. So maybe something even more compelling is, how do you feel when you have no control over decisions that directly affect you? Your point of view is irrelevant, absolutely. So these are some of the thoughts that and some of the reasons why thousands of African Americans and many Anglo Americans became part of the Underground Railroad, because they felt victimized. And we want to speak of the Underground Railroad tonight, and specifically the Underground Railroad in Southeast Kansas. Now, most people think about the Underground Railroad because it had roots all over America. But we want to focus more on the more familiar parts in this part of the country. And mostly people think about the Lane Trail, and it's named for Senator and General James Lane. And it runs through northern Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. But it starts in Topeka. So tonight, we're here to discuss the lesser known and very dangerous story of the road to freedom from the Indian and Kansas territories. So the years of 1854 to 1861 were a turbulent time in the Kansas territory during what is known as Bleeding Kansas. Murder, mayhem, destruction, psychological warfare became the code of conduct in eastern Kansas and western Missouri. It wasn't safe to go out at night, in the rural areas especially, and you didn't want to go out alone during the day. So imagine you're traveling down on the Underground Railroad and you're approaching a home with a lantern that's hanging out front. And A lantern presumably identifies this as a safe house. So what's going through your mind? How do you really know this house is safe? How do you feel as you hear your own hand knocking on that door? Those seeking freedom were definitely underground, staying safe by following waterways paralleling the military road around the city of Fort Scott and up to Mound City, Paris, Topeka. But that was a tough road and a personal fight for freedom that most couldn't do alone. They had to rely on other people such as David Ruggles, John Brown, Isaac Hooper, Captain William Matthews, and Harriet Tubman. So through these trials and tribulations, they found rewards and the ability to shift from a personal fight to an open and official fight for their rights for freedom in the U.S. Army, the 1st Kansas Infantry.
Hi, my name is Brian Mayhew, Park Ranger at Fort Scott National Historic Site. Perhaps you've seen the movie Glory. It depicts the story of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry as the first African-American regiment in the United States Army. However, Hollywood doesn't always get it right. The 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry Regiment was mustered into the U.S. Army on January 13, 1863, right here in Fort Scott, Kansas, a whole 4.5 months before the 54th Massachusetts. Organized as a state unit 5 months prior, men of the 1st Kansas became the first African Americans in the U.S. Army to go into combat and give their lives in battle. Kansas Senator and General James Lane began recruiting the African American soldiers in August of 1862. Most of the recruits were freed slaves from Missouri or escaped slaves from Missouri and Arkansas. Because of this, many African Americans were proud to serve in the Union. They felt it was their duty to fight against the Confederacy and the power that had enslaved and oppressed their people for generations. The arming of black troops was not popular in the North, however. Even President Lincoln was concerned the border states would secede if the Union allowed black troops in the Army. This did not stop General Lane from recruiting these men. The Fort Scott Bulletin reported on August 16, 1862,
Colored regiments. General Lane is still going on with the work of organizing 2 colored regiments, notwithstanding the refusal of the president to accept black soldiers. Last Tuesday, about 50 recruits were raised here.
The first battle in which African American soldiers served in combat took place at the Battle of Island Mound, Missouri, on October 29, 1862. 225 African American troops faced 500 Confederates. Although the 1st Kansas lost 10 men and 12 more were injured, they drove off the Confederates. While the engagement was not of great importance militarily, its historical and psychological importance should not be underestimated. The performance of the 1st Kansas helped encourage the enlistment of black troops and their eventual use as Union regulars. Guerrilla chieftain Bill Turman said of the soldiers that
The Black Devils fought like tigers.
some of the African American soldiers were officers in the 1st Kansas Colored before it was mustered into the Union Army in 1863. Captain William Matthews and Lieutenant Patrick Minor were 2 of these men. Both men were leaders in the Battle of Island Mound and well respected and liked by their troops and from fellow white officers. However, when the 1st Kansas was mustered into the Union Army at Fort Scott in 1863, these men could no longer serve as officers and had to enlist as privates. There were other problems that the soldiers of the 1st Kansas faced. White soldiers were not always fond of serving alongside of African Americans. Regiments were segregated and led by white officers. There was a significant discrepancy in pay as well. Black soldiers received $10 per month and had $3 deducted from their pay for clothing, while white soldiers of the same rank were given $13 per month and were given a $3.50 clothing allowance. Confederate troops were also harsh against African American soldiers as well as their white commanders. The Confederate Congress threatened to punish severely the officers of black troops. Soldiers captured from black units were given no quarter, meaning that they would not be held as prisoners of war, but would be executed or returned to slavery. Kansas was just one of 163 African American units that served in the Union Army during the Civil War. The number of men serving in these units totaled approximately 185,000. Both free African Americans and runaway slaves joined the Army. African American units fought in every major campaign in 1864 and 1865 except Sherman's invasion of Georgia. African Americans made up approximately 10% of the Union Army and suffered high casualties. Nearly 1 in 3 African Americans that enrolled in the military lost their lives during the Civil War. Famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass is quoted as saying,
"Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship."
So this is the big picture for the Underground Railroad, the ability to fight for that freedom. But other than a few famous freedom fighters like Harriet Tubman, who, we don't often talk about who traveled that Underground Railroad, which is something that we were lucky enough last summer because of Calvin Osborne, a gentleman who just by chance happened to be the president of the 54th Massachusetts Reenactment Group out of Washington, D.C., found that he was a great-great-grandson of William Lacey. He reached out to us because he was talking with different groups back east and talking about the freedom fights and talking about the 54th Massachusetts. And CNN approached him saying, "Hey, we found some information that connects you to the 1st Kansas." So he reached out to us to find out more. So the first place I looked was in the Soldiers in the Army of Freedom by Spurgeon. And absolutely, right there, he was part of the 54th, of the 1st Kansas. Now, at this point, the 1st Kansas was no longer known as that. In the end of 1864, the Department of Defense had wanted to reorganize all the units so that there was consistent naming. So they became the 79th, and he was in Company K of that. So I looked a little farther, and I found some of his military records. So it shows that he was, at 17, mustered in. Now, we also saw that this was just right after the 79th had been formed, because they even had to write that in there. It wasn't actually printed on the document yet. But we also found something that was a bit telling, that he was from Morgan County, Alabama, and listed as a farmer at 17. So if he's 17 in 1865, would he have been born a free man in Alabama in 1843? Very, very doubtful. So we look to Morgan County, Alabama, and most likely as a slave, and we follow his journey from Morgan County. His owner took him up to Fort Smith in Arkansas, and that's where he saw his chance for freedom. And he escaped into the Indian Territory across into what is now Oklahoma. And there he met Lucinda and traveled up to Paris, Kansas. Lucinda was a Creek tribal member, and he traveled up to Paris, Kansas. We don't know if he married her in Paris or if he married her in the Indian Territory, but they became husband and wife. And then in 1865, he became Private Lacey and was immediately sent back into the territory he had fought so hard to escape. But now the fight was for his rights and the rights of all African Americans. And he was in the military down in Pine Bluff all the way till the end of the war. And then after fighting so hard and earning his freedom and the freedom of all African Americans, he returned home to Paris, Kansas, to his wife, and started a family. Now, this is a story of just one man who made a difference. And there are thousands of others. And I ask, if this were you, how far would you go for your rights? Think about it. And how far would you go for someone else's? So as I say, this is just one man and one story. There are thousands of stories like this. We just have to find them. Stories of African Americans, as we're talking about now, that have gone through the Underground Railroad. Stories of Native Americans who fought in the Indian Home Guard. Stories of the women and children who have fought for freedom. So I just challenge you to open your minds to look to those things and help tell those stories. And that's what we do here in the National Park Service, is we find those stories and we share those stories, and continue to share those stories. So we're hoping to continue to work with Calvin to find out more about his great-great-grandfather and more about what he did and where he was. And we've just started scratching the surface. And I'm hoping that as you tune in to Freedom's Frontier, you'll find lots more stories being shared in the future. So I turn this back over to Jim, and for any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Carl. We really appreciate it. And let me start out by asking, what do you think you might, how many records exist in the archives you have? And I may have asked that wrong. How many people are represented by records in your archives for the mustering in there at Fort Scott?
So he was not mustered in at Fort Scott. He was mustered in Paris.
Okay.
The first Kansas had already moved out of Fort Scott by this time. So as far as, we have hundreds of records of African Americans who had been mustered in here. I had to search out to the National Archives for his records because he was mustered in outside of the fort. There are a lot of records that you can find just by doing searches on websites like what I had done. Hold on just a sec. Through www.fold3.com. You can find all kinds of military records there, and they're absolutely free. So you can do searches on all different military conflicts, on names. There's a lot of different ways you can search for records, and I happen to narrow it down because there was a lot of overlapping information. If, like, for Ancestry.com has overlapping information. The Grave Finder has some information listed for William Lacey that isn't this William Lacey. So you have to take some of that with a grain of salt and try to cross-reference different items to make sure they truly are what they are.
So, Carl, are there any records that you all have at Fort Scott that are nowhere else?
They would all be in the National Archives as well.
So everything you've got is also duplicated digitally and available, because I know that's been a big
well,
effort.
Some of the things we have are specific to this fort, but any of the records for enlistment or mustering in would also be in the National Archives. A lot of the information and documents that were created here during the fort era, the letters, the correspondence and things between the officers or the men and their different headquarters up in Leavenworth or back in DC or in Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, those would be specific to us. But all of the mustering in documents would also be in the National Archives.
Carl, in your research, Holly Zane is asking, were the 200 or so Oneida, I may have pronounced that wrong, tribal members removed from New York and Wisconsin to their reservation near Fort Scott involved in the Underground Railroad and or incidents about Bleeding Kansas? She notes they vanished in a short period of time.
So all the records about the different tribes, primarily because of the 1830 Indian Removal Act, that is not information that is part of the National Park Service record. There is, oh my gosh, it is The library, I can follow up with you on that. I want to say Kansas City, but I don't know that to be a fact. That's not part of the National Park Services or the military record. That's a completely different department of the Native American groups that were moved.
Fort Scott, Carl, has a long history of some extraordinary African Americans there, not only because of the efforts of the fort, but also others along the way. What other opportunities, if you come down to Fort Scott, are there to explore these different stories right there in Fort Scott?
So between the fort itself, which we are just scratching the surface on those, our website has a tremendous amount of information on it. Coming to the site, we do different programs at different times on that. We don't always have something on the First Kansas or other African American people that have played a role in it. We are working through the National Park Service and different partners here in town on a grant to start telling those stories more and have students in the area create videos to help tell those stories. We haven't received funding of that yet, but all those will go up on our website and be available at nps.gov. But the Genealogy Society has information on different people who have been important here. If you go down to George Washington Carver, he had spent time here in Fort Scott. He was a resident, or went to school here in what is our post hospital after it had been decommissioned by the Department of Defense. Gordon Parks had gone to school here when we had the Hawkins School that was on the parade, or just below the parade ground. So there's different organizations in town here that will also tell those stories.
That's a wonderful litany of a community that is, relatively small in comparison population-wise, but has had a real impact in its storytelling and the like, including the folks who are also so helpful with teachers there in the Unsung Heroes, just a few blocks away from you.
Yeah, they're one of our partners on this grant to try to tell those stories better with the Gordon Parks Museum, the Lowell Milken Center, the high school here in Fort Scott and Uniontown, and the community college. And then also working with the Gordon Parks family, since he was into filming, to help in the production of some of these videos.
Well, that's outstanding. For all the people who look at the different cycles of history that are associated with Fort Scott, when did the fort stop being an active fort?
So that's something that's asked a lot, and I appreciate you asking that. It was built in 1842, and it was operated all the way up until 1853, when the West was deemed to have moved farther west, and the military was no longer needed here along that military road that ran initially from Leavenworth down to Fort Gibson. So at that time, the fort was closed. There was still a caretaker here on site all the way up until 1855, when the fort was officially auctioned off. And then the fort, what is known as Fort Scott, became then the town of Fort Scott.
An interesting history. And then your history as a national park site, can you tell us a little bit about that story and how you came to reclaim the fort, if you will?
So that's a story of the people of Fort Scott. There was a push to try to resurrect specific buildings Primarily the one you might see in the background behind me, that was one of the officers' duplexes, and that actually it was at the other end, not the one directly behind me with the well canopy, but they wanted to try to restore a building, and so they started raising funds to do archaeology around the site and to restore that building. And they began enlisting the help from Senator Joe Skubitz, and it began to snowball, and they were raising more funds, and they did some major archaeology in the 60s of the whole area to try to figure out where the actual buildings were. There was a lot that wasn't known other than that this was the fort, and some drawings from 1848 from the second quartermaster of the fort, of where the buildings were and where the walls were and what was actually on the ground here. Using that as a guide, they did a lot of archaeology and then began the reconstruction. Now, that took a decade or more, or over a decade to do. And in 1978, Congress actually designated Fort Scott National Historic Site as a national park site. It was still owned by the city of Fort Scott as they were taking the lead on all this, but they were realizing that this was too big a project to manage on their own. So that's when this Park Service became involved. And in the spring of 1979, it was turned from the city of Fort Scott to the federal government and the National Park Service. And that's when we became a national park site, officially visited.
Outstanding, outstanding. Well, we really do appreciate your presentation this evening, and I thank you for being a part of this series of the Underground Railroad sites. And hopefully, as we move forward, we're going to be able to find ways to expand the Underground Railroad stories and do a better job of connecting these sites along the way. I think it's so incredibly important for all of us to be able to share these stories from these different sites and put those connections together. Thank you so much, Carl, for being a part of this series, and look forward to working with you on sharing those stories in the future.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. I hope we sparked your interest and led you down some new trails that you hadn't gone down before or hadn't thought about. And I will look up to try to get some answers for Holly on specifically where to find some of that information. And if either she reaches out to me or we can put some information up on our Facebook page that she can just find anonymously. It's whatever she would prefer to do.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Carl. And we'll bid you a good night. And we want to ask all of you who've been a part of our program this evening, we very much appreciate your participation. I also note that we have a number of people who participated who I've seen as regular attendees at our other programs along the way. So multiple thanks to you as we end our series now and get prepared for when we do this again in September of 2021. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Our best wishes, and I hope you have a very good evening. Take care.